In January 1995, the brutal slayings of Grant Henderson and Michelle Cartagena shocked the community near Macon, Georgia. The couple, both young and promising, were found shot to death at a secluded lover's lane along Lake Juliet. On the night of January 2nd, 1995, Grant Henderson and Michelle Cartagena were last seen together, enjoying a date before heading to a quiet lakeside parking area. The following morning, authorities discovered their lifeless bodies in Michelle's white Honda parked by the lake. The crime scene was perplexing. Investigators found evidence that the killer had fired 14 rounds from an AR-15 rifle and followed up with additional shots from a 9mm handgun. Oddly, Michelle's body had been moved and partially undressed, and the perp even left traces of tobacco spit on her. Early theories among investigators ranged widely. One prominent idea was that the killings resulted from a random act of violence, a lone predator striking an unsuspecting couple. Eyewitnesses reported seeing a blue Honda CRX in the vicinity that night, a detail that immediately became a focus for detectives. Other accounts focused on a movie theater patron who recalled seeing Grant and Michelle involved in a heated argument with a young man. This led some to speculate that jealousy or personal conflict might have played a role. Despite these theories, neither motive nor clear suspect emerged, leaving both law enforcement and the community frustrated. Determined to find leads, investigators deployed a range of forensic and investigative methods that were considered cutting edge at the time. The first major breakthrough came from ballistic analysis. Recovering shell casings at the scene allowed forensic teams to link the weapons used in the crime to specific weapon models. Detectives then combed through sales records and pawnshop transactions in the region, eventually focusing on a local man named Andrew Cook. Records showed that Cook had purchased an AR-15 in August 1994, and later, pawnshop receipts tied him to the very weapon used in the slayings. Forensic specialists also turned their attention to the unusual detail of the tobacco spit found on Michelle. Although DNA testing hadn't yet gained the prominence it would achieve just a few short years later, the evidence was preserved and eventually processed. This analysis would later provide a direct link between the crime scene and Cook, adding yet another layer of evidence against him. Another innovative aspect of the investigation was the linking of physical evidence with eyewitness accounts. The blue Honda CRX seen by witnesses was traced to Andrew Cook, whose vehicle matched the description exactly. By connecting the dots between the car, the weapons, and the physical evidence from the scene, law enforcement built a strong case that pointed squarely to Cook as the likely suspect. In an unusual investigative twist, the authorities enlisted the help of Andrew Cook's own father, a retired FBI agent, to gain further insight. While in custody, Cook was visited by his father, a trusted figure who managed to coax a confession from his son. The conversation, recorded and later presented in court, revealed that Cook admitted to being at the scene and carrying out the slayings purely to test if he could get away with it. This personal intervention, though emotionally fraught, proved pivotal in turning circumstantial evidence into a confession. In March 1998, Cook faced charges for the slayings of Grant Henderson and Michelle Cartagena. The prosecution laid out a compelling case, supported by forensic evidence, eyewitness testimony, and the damning confession obtained with the help of his father. The courtroom drama reached its peak when Cook's father took the stand, visibly torn between his duty as a law enforcement officer and his pain as a parent. The defense didn't contest Cook's guilt, but instead focused on mitigating factors such as his youth and mental health issues. They argued that his troubled state might have influenced his actions. However, the overwhelming evidence and the raw emotional impact of his father's testimony left little room for doubt. The jury ultimately convicted Andrew Cook on 2 counts of malice slaying, and the sentencing phase led to a recommendation for the death penalty. Following the trial, Andrew Cook was placed on death row in Georgia. His case went through the standard appeals process that's common in capital cases. His legal team fought for years to overturn the sentence, arguing that his confession might have been coerced by the emotional pressure of his father's involvement. Additional issues related to his mental health were brought up, again particularly in relation to the confession. Despite these appeals, every legal challenge was denied, and the death sentence remained intact. In February 2013, after nearly 15 years on death row, Cook's clemency appeal was rejected by the Georgia State Board of Pardons and Paroles. A final appeal challenging the state's lethal injection method briefly delayed the execution, but this stay was lifted by the Georgia Supreme Court on the day of the act. On February 21, 2013, Andrew Cook was ended via lethal injection. Before his execution, Cook offered a brief statement of remorse, apologizing for the senseless act that had not only claimed 2 innocent lives, but also devastated his own family. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to hit subscribe and share this video on your socials and with your friends. Also, if you're new to my channels, check out Lazy Chill Zone and Lazy Chill History for way more content. In December 1993, Waterloo, Iowa was rocked by 2 brutal slayings that continue to confound investigators and haunt the local community. 2 elderly residents, 83-year-old Gladys Held and 87-year-old Jacob Barretts, were found dead in their own apartments on consecutive nights. These cases, marked by striking similarities in method and timing, have led many to suspect a single, elusive criminal may be responsible. Despite extensive investigations and modern forensic advances, the truth behind these acts remains a mystery. On the night of December 8, 1993, Gladys Held, a retired secretary, was attacked in her apartment at the Walnut Court Retirement Community at 315 Walnut Street. The following morning, when a concerned resident discovered that Gladys had missed her daily in-house service, alarm bells were raised. Initially, staff suspected that she may have had a medical emergency in the night. Responding officers found her lying in bed in disarray, with belongings scattered around the room. Evidence indicated that Gladys had been struck with her telephone and then strangled to death. Investigators later noted that Gladys's door was left unlocked and that a broken glass panel on an exterior door hinted at forced entry. A neighbor had even reported an unknown man entering an apartment the previous night and demanding money before retreating when refused. Although nothing of significant value appeared to have been stolen, the signs pointed to a burglary that escalated into a horrific act. The shocking nature of the crime left residents of Walnut Court fearful for their own safety, prompting the building's management to hire private security and urge tenants to remain vigilant. Less than 24 hours after the slaying of Gladys Held, another tragedy struck only a few blocks away. Jacob Barretts, affectionately known as Old Jake by locals, was found dead in his apartment at 311 Lafayette Street on the morning of December 10, 1993. Barretts, a retired auto mechanic who lived a quiet and solitary life, had already experienced a violent incident 2 weeks earlier during Thanksgiving weekend. In that previous home invasion, his apartment door was kicked in, and an assailant, described as a man dressed entirely in black, pepper-sprayed and brutally beat him before stealing cash. Adding to the eerie connection between this act and the later slayings, part of this brutal assault included an attempt to strangle Jake. Jake advised the authorities that he had recently gotten into a dispute with a cab driver over what he believed to be unfair charges on a trip back to his apartment from a bar. Although Jake survived that attack, the scars of the assault were a painful reminder of the dangers he faced. On the night of December 9th, a neighbor noticed unusual activity near Barretts' apartment, reportedly observing a man wandering the complex and hearing a disturbance later that evening. When this neighbor and the landlady checked on Jake the next morning, they found him on his couch with his arms neatly crossed over his chest. The autopsy later determined that he had died from asphyxia caused by suffocation, likely the result of being smothered with a pillow. Unlike the extremely violent struggle in Held's apartment, Baretz's scene appeared controlled, almost as though the perpetrator had taken time to stage the scene. Given that Jake had already been targeted in a robbery, many began to wonder if the same criminal had returned to finish the job. The close timing and geographical proximity of these two slayings immediately raised suspicions that they might be the work of a single perpetrator. The two apartment buildings are situated only a few blocks apart, and both crimes occurred during the night. Although the exact details of each crime differ slightly, the overall pattern indicates that the perp might have been targeting vulnerable elderly residents, possibly with the intent to commit robbery. Police eventually began to treat the crimes as connected, and by 2005, officials were openly stating their belief that one man was behind both crimes. From the outset, the investigations into these slayings faced significant obstacles. Both cases yielded very few leads, and despite an intensive police effort, no eyewitnesses came forward with any definitive information. Forensic teams collected blood samples, hair fibers, and trace evidence from both scenes. Yet, no usable fingerprints were found, suggesting that the perp may have taken precautions, such as wearing gloves. Although DNA profiling was still emerging as an investigative tool at the time, the samples collected from both crime scenes have yet to match any known offender in the state database. And one question I had, and I'm sure you do too, is whether these two DNA samples match with one another. Well, I hate to break it to you, but the answer isn't readily available. That said, reading between the lines, you'll recall that in 2005 the cops said, "They think it was the same guy. I think that's confirmation that the DNA from the scenes matches." All that said, the lack of a DNA match to a database continues to be one of the major stumbling blocks in solving these cases. The limited physical evidence was compounded by the absence of clear eyewitness testimony. In the case of Gladys Held, aside from a neighbor's report of a suspicious intruder demanding money, no one witnessed the crime. Similarly, although a neighbor reported hearing disturbances at Jacob Baretz's apartment, by the time anyone arrived, the assailant had already vanished into the night. In January 1994, Gladys Held's son even offered a reward for information that could lead to an arrest, but this too failed to produce any tangible leads. As a result, police were left with only circumstantial evidence to pursue, and despite periodic reviews by cold case units in later years, the perpetrator has never been identified. The scarcity of definitive evidence has given rise to numerous speculative theories about who might be behind these acts. One of the most popular ideas is that a single criminal was targeting elderly residents in Waterloo. Proponents of this theory point to the vulnerability of the victims and the methodical nature of the crimes as evidence that the assailant was experienced and calculated in his approach. According to this view, the perpetrator deliberately chose seniors who lived alone, making them easy targets for a burglary that quickly escalated. Another theory that has received significant attention centers on the individual implicated in Jacob Baretz's earlier robbery. Baretz had expressed suspicion that a particular cab driver was responsible for his brutal assault during Thanksgiving weekend. Although this taxi driver theory is intriguing, law enforcement has never publicly confirmed a strong link between him and either crime. Beyond the main theories, alternative ideas have circulated among amateur sleuths. Some speculate that the acts were not solely crimes of opportunity, but part of a broader plan to instill fear in the community. A few online theorists have suggested that the perpetrator might have been emboldened by what he perceived as lax security measures in senior housing. These theorists suggest this enabled him to target vulnerable residents with minimal risk of detection. Although there's little evidence to support a personal vendetta or a message-driven motive, this possibility adds yet another layer of complexity to these cases. Personally, I think the best chance for resolution of these cases is through genetic genealogy. The perpetrator's DNA has been cataloged, and these days, even if he isn't in a database, so long as one of his relatives wants to know what percentage Irish they are, he'll be caught. Lita McClinton Sullivan was a prominent American socialite whose untimely death in January 1987 shocked the nation. On the morning that her divorce was to be finalized, she was fatally shot while accepting a delivery of pink roses at her Atlanta home. The investigation that followed uncovered a tangled web of betrayal and greed that eventually pointed to her estranged husband, James Sullivan, as the man behind her slaying. Lita McClinton was born on January 7, 1952, into an influential and wealthy Black Atlanta family. Her mother, Joanne McClinton, served as a state representative, and her father, Emory McClinton, had a distinguished career with the U.S. Department of Transportation. Growing up in a family well known for its political and social standing, Lita enjoyed a privileged upbringing. She excelled in school and later graduated from Spelman College with a degree in political science. These accomplishments and her poised manner made her a beloved figure in Atlanta's social circles. In contrast, her husband, James Sullivan, was a white man from Boston with working-class origins. After moving to Georgia to help run his uncle's successful liquor distribution business, Sullivan quickly ascended into the world of high society. He and Lita were married in 1976, in a union that many at the time found surprising. However, behind the glamorous facade of their life together lay a turbulent marriage marred by Sullivan's infidelity, manipulation, and controlling behavior. On January 16, 1987, Lita was preparing for a pivotal day in her life. A divorce hearing was scheduled that day, a moment that promised to settle the contentious issues of their separation. Instead, the morning brought a shock that would forever change the McClinton family. At approximately 8:20 a.m., a man arrived at Lita's doorstep with a box of pink roses. According to eyewitness reports, when Lita answered the door, the delivery man unexpectedly produced a pistol and fired 2 shots. One bullet missed, but the other struck Lita in the temple, leading to her death within minutes of arriving at Piedmont Hospital. The manner of the slaying was as symbolic as it was brutal. The use of a floral delivery, a gesture typically associated with love or celebration, became a grim prelude to a calculated slaying. In the wake of Lita's demise, investigators faced a challenging case that spanned multiple jurisdictions. James Sullivan naturally became the immediate focus of attention, and sometimes the most obvious person is the one responsible. Initial clues centered around the fact that the delivery man appeared to have been in disguise. With few immediate leads, law enforcement was forced to piece together details from phone records, witness statements, and Sullivan's travel itinerary. It soon emerged that while Lita had been at home, her husband was in Palm Beach, Florida. However, evidence began to mount that pointed to Sullivan's indirect involvement in orchestrating the act. A key breakthrough in the investigation came years later when Philip Anthony Harwood was identified as the hitman. Harwood admitted that he had been paid $25,000 to carry out the slaying, and his testimony eventually implicated James Sullivan as the one who hired him. Although Harwood later maintained that he didn't personally pull the trigger, his role as the intermediary and his financial transaction with Sullivan provided compelling evidence. And just to be clear, it's still not clear who actually pulled the trigger, but most seem to agree it was Harwood. James's controlling and deceitful behavior painted a picture of a man willing to resort to extreme measures to protect his financial interests. With divorce proceedings looming and a substantial division of assets at stake, Sullivan had a clear motive to eliminate his wife and thereby control the outcome of the divorce settlement. Despite Sullivan's physical absence on the day of the slaying, investigators were able to connect him to the crime through a series of phone records and travel logs. Notably, a collect call from Sullivan was made from a location near Lita's home shortly after the shooting. These records, along with other circumstantial evidence, gradually built a case against him. His subsequent flight from justice, fleeing to various countries, and eventually being apprehended in Thailand, further reinforced suspicions that he was trying to escape accountability. Years later, after an international manhunt, Sullivan was arrested in Thailand in 2002 and extradited back to the United States. In 2006, after a long and arduous legal battle, an Atlanta jury convicted Sullivan of arranging the hit. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, marking a measure of justice for Lita's family. Notably, Harwood's testimony was crucial to securing a conviction. Harwood himself, despite almost certainly being the triggerman, has since been released from prison.